Shalom and welcome to the first Middle East report of 2024, and in this programme we'll be telling you the latest developments in Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza and its regional implications. Happy New Year, and I have two very stellar guests joining me as we discuss the latest developments taking place with Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. I'm joined by Michael Kritzmer, who's a documentary filmmaker, made the famous film JQs, together with Tony Pierce from Light for the Last Days. So, gentlemen, Happy New Year to you both, and thank you so much for being here on the first Middle East report of 2024, and we thought 2023 was dramatic. It looks like we're set for another dramatic year in Israel and the Middle East. I'll start off with you, Michael. Firstly, thank you for the excellent programme recorded in May where we unpacked your incredible documentary called JQs, looking at Lithuania's role in the Holocaust, which I think was one of those forgotten histories that you brought to light. So absolutely valuable piece of journalism and so needed, particularly as we explore the Holocaust 80 years on. But share with us a little bit about your Jewish background with us and your background in kind of journalism, because you work for all the big mainstream media corporations in this country.
Well, I grew up in southern Africa, and I was part of the Jewish community there in a country called, well, it was Southern Rhodesia when I was born, later became Rhodesia and then became Zimbabwe. And we had a small Jewish community there. I say small, at its height it was probably 500 families. So it seemed very big to me. And it was typical of all the Lithuanian-based Jewish communities. It was quite orthopraxic, it was ambitious. We were hidden, the Holocaust stories of our grandparents were all hidden from us. And that's why I made my later film JQs, in order to tell that story. But I personally grew up in a fairly secular home, although we were tied to Orthodox Judaism, but we weren't at all Orthodox. We ate bacon, and we had almost no religion. We had Jewish culture, certainly, and we had a kind of soft socialist Zionism, which was very powerful, but religion, no. And I kind of left Judaism for a very long time. I came to this country in 1976. I became a journalist. I worked for the BBC, I worked for the Sunday Times, I worked for Channel 4, I made films for these organizations. And it was only much later that I re-established my links with Judaism. I think it was largely to do with the birth of my first child, but also it was to do with being Jewish in a very hostile world. And I'd spent some time in Israel. I'd lived in Israel a while. And from a very early stage, it became apparent to me, particularly when I worked at the BBC, of the hostility in some quarters towards the Jewish state. And over the years, I've become more and more tuned to it. I've become more religious. And that's where I am today. I'm a passionate supporter of Israel, somebody who's worried about the position of Jews in the diaspora again, even in this great country, which I really never expected to happen. And that's where we are now.
Excellent. And I'd like to, it's great to have you on the programme, Tony.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. And so this is what I like about this programme. It's a nice mix of kind of Christian and Jewish perspective as we come in defence of the one and only Jewish state, which is the nation of Israel. So Tony, you write this excellent publication called Light for the Last Days. So just share with us what you do and also your role as a pastor as well at Bridge Lane, right in the heart of the Jewish community in Golders Green.
Okay, thank you, Simon. It's good to be with you. Yeah, I've been writing Light for the Last Days for about 30 years now. I've always been interested in writing. When I left university, I had two ideas of what I should be. One was to be a journalist, the other was to be a teacher. And I now end up teaching at Bridge Lane and writing this magazine, which is kind of journalistic, I guess.
Absolutely.
But yeah, when I became a Christian in 1970, having come from a fairly sort of nominal Christian, but then became kind of left-wing Marxist at university and found Jesus as my Saviour and Lord on New Year's Day, 1970. I always had an interest in Israel as well. And I remember in 1967, leading up to the Six-Day War, I was in my second year at Cambridge and hearing the news about Nasser and the Egyptians gathering on the borders of Israel and saying they're going to push the Jews into the sea. And I just felt it was insignificant. I actually hitchhiked down to London and offered my services at a Jewish agency, and parents were horrified at the idea. And as it happened, Israel did pretty well in 6 days without any help from me. But from that time onwards, I had an interest in Israel. And when I became a Christian, I read the Bible and began to see that these things are prophesied in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and even in Jesus' teaching about the birth of the fig tree, saw a significance in the rebirth of Israel. And I guess it all went from there. And I kind of also related other events happening in the world, you know, wars and rumours of wars, the earthquakes, the famines, all this stuff happening, and how it's all coming together and leading up to what the Bible calls Acharit HaYamim, or the end of days, and the second coming of Jesus from the New Testament point of view. So this is what we write, and I speak about it at the fellowship at Bridge Lane in northwest London, in Golders Green.
Excellent. And you do reach out to the local Jewish community?
Yeah. And actually, after the October the 7th, we put together just a little leaflet sort of to our Jewish friends and neighbours, expressing our sympathy for what had happened and also our concern about the anti-Semitism and the build-up of all the demonstrations taking place in London and the hatred of Jews which was coming out in so many places, especially on social media and in the demonstrations. And we gave it out, and I've had so many replies and people appreciating it and saying how pleased they were, and got invited to a synagogue meeting or at Hanukkah, and had a lot of opportunities to just to say, you know, that we're with you and that we stand for Israel at this time.
That's wonderful.
Which we do.
Thank you, Tony. And Michael, I mean, we can't talk about 2024 without talking about the horrific events of October the 7th, the biggest mass terrorist attack against Israel in Israel's history, the largest number of Jews massacred since the Holocaust of over 80 years ago. And of course, now the aftermath of that is the Israeli ground incursion into Gaza to destroy Hamas. So where were you on that horrific day on Saturday, the 7th of October? And when did you learn about the horrors that were unfolding?
It's really hard to express the enormity of what happened on October the 7th, if you're Jewish. It's really hard to understand it. Even I'm struggling to understand it now. I was actually on my way back to South Africa for a family holiday and for a wedding, and somebody called me early in the morning saying, what's going on in Israel now? And I assumed it would be another typical Gazan Hamas terrorist attack, rockets across the border, maybe an attempt to fire an RPG or something like that at a settlement or a vehicle. But pretty soon, within hours, it became clear that there were not just a few casualties, that there were hundreds of casualties. And when we realized that a lot of the people who were murdered had been in their kibbutzim and at that party in the desert, we understood, anybody who knows anything about Hamas, understood the gravity of what had happened there. And since then, really, every day, if you're at all associated with Israel, you see the pictures of the dead. These beautiful young people who are cut down in their prime. You meet their families, you meet their girlfriends and boyfriends, you meet their dogs and their animals. And I cannot tell you the sense of grief that has been shared across the Jewish world in the weeks and months since then. I have to say, though, I don't think it's all bad news. I think the way we, the Jewish people, have responded, both in Israel and the diaspora, has been extraordinary. I'll make one point. On the 6th of October, or early on the 7th of October, Israel was more divided than it's ever been. Really, there was no dialogue between the various communities of Israel. The ultra-Orthodox weren't speaking to the Orthodox weren't speaking to the secular were only speaking to themselves, and there was no efficient government. There was no even idea of Israel. People were refusing to do their reserve duties. Pilots were refusing to fly airplanes. That's how bad it was. And Hamas, I'm not surprised, saw this as a great opportunity. They will have looked on this and seen an Israel that was desperately disunited. What they didn't understand is the Jewish story, and that within hours of this, Israel was more united than it's ever been. that they did us in a sense a favor. They brought our country together again. And not just that, they brought the diaspora Jews in with Israel. Because we now know what we're facing in the world. We know we only have one country, and sure as hell we're not going to allow that country to be taken from us. I think Israel emerges from this incomparably stronger, but absolutely grief-stricken. And I've shared that grief since then. Actually, I haven't been able to write anything since the 7th of October because the grief is so great. We're still in that process of dealing with it, but we also have the fight to deal with now, which I guess is not an uplifting thing, but a humanizing experience. And perhaps later I'll discuss the good things that have happened out of this, this war, because there are many, actually.
Good analysis. Thank you, Michael. And the same question for you, Tony. When did you first discover the horrors that were taking place on October the 7th, and where were you? I mean, this is one of these moments like 9/11.
I was at home preparing my sermon for the following day, which I completely scrubbed. And we turned the whole service into focusing on Israel and Gaza and what had happened, and we then had a prayer meeting after the service to pray for Israel. And I think I did a talk on Psalm 83 and the relevance of the nations round about and calling for Israel's destruction, and how God was bringing them together to stand for the truth. And I also mentioned the Islamic dimension, and I think was one of the things we've actually done a bit of teaching on in the fellowship, about how there is this rejection of Israel, by Islam, which most of all those guys who go down London sort of demonstrating from the river to the sea have no idea what they're getting into, because what they're getting into is the Islamic jihad, which wants not just the end of Israel, but also the end of most of Western civilization and Christianity, if they're Christians. And we see this coming together of all these forces, whether they're Islamic, leftist, anti-Israel, coming together. And we felt we really have to make a stand against it and stand up for Israel's right to exist, and also the fact that this is relevant to us as well as Christians, that it's not just a Jewish question, it's also an assault on the Bible, on the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, and ultimately on Jesus. I mean, one of the things I was speaking about last Sunday actually was the idea they're now trying to make Jesus into a Palestinian and rewrite history so that Jesus becomes a Palestinian hero rather than Jewish Messiah, and actually how Jewish people are actually beginning to rediscover the Jewishness of Jesus, because it's part of the need to stand for historical truth. And yet we have this huge deception which is coming upon the world, which is coming from the Islamic side, which would want to rewrite history, make Abraham even a Muslim and Jesus a Muslim, and that all this Palestine, the country was always called Palestine, whereas we know that it was only in 135 after the Bar Kokhba rebellion that the Romans renamed it Palestina, and calling it Palestine is to take it away from the Jewish context. And so you have this rewriting of history and rewriting the Jewish part out of it. And if you understand the Christian part, you're also taking the Christian part out. And that's why we need to stand for it as Jews and Christians together. Absolutely. And I think that I've now mentioned this last time, that in the talk on Sunday, that Jerusalem Post had an article saying how we have to rediscover the Jewishness of Jesus in our propaganda war against the Palestinians rewriting history.
That's interesting to say that, because the Israeli Foreign Ministry have put up a video saying that Jesus was not a Palestinian.
Oh yeah,
done a cartoon. I saw it. I could have had it ready for this program, but
yeah.
Michael, I think before we really talk about where we are here on the first week of January 2024, we have to recap of the events that have happened since October the 7th. Since then, we've seen Israel mobilise their reservists, somewhere in the region of 360 to 370,000 troops, which is crippling the Israeli economy. We've known that Israelis living in the diaspora have all flown back to Israel to serve and defend the state of Israel. We know that virtually there are very few flights now flying in and out of Tel Aviv. The situation now on the ground is that obviously the Israelis have gone into Gaza. They've taken Gaza City. They are dismantling the terror tunnels and dismantling Hamas, and now they're taking the fight to Hamas in Khan Yunis in the south. plus also a time we've had some hostages released, others, is it 130, still remain captive either by Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Have the situation in the north with Hezbollah flaring up, and of course the Iranians are the one that's stoking all the fires. So what does this tell us about how we are going into 2024 with all the challenges and the threats that Israel's facing in the last few months?
I would say the level of threat now is less than it was a couple of weeks ago. Both Iran and Hezbollah have signaled that they do not intend to prosecute this war too earnestly, but we all know that mistakes can happen, and it's certainly possible. They have, I think, 150,000 rockets pointed at us. There's been a huge depopulation in the north, so as you say, it's a hugely disruptive economic force on this. But I think they know that if they do try anything, they'll be crushed, and that Lebanon will suffer enormously. And frankly, Hezbollah is not popular in Lebanon. It's taken power in the usual nefarious ways through pressure and terror and threats and violence. And they've got to tread very carefully in Lebanon because their position there is far from secure. Likewise, Iran is not as strong as it sometimes pretends to be. They have huge problems, all self-inflicted. I'm glad they have them. And they're looking extremely vulnerable at the moment. Also, I think what Israel showed by its courage, you know, the Miluim, the reserve rate uptake was 160%. 160% of reservists came. In other words, 60% more than the full complement. And we've signaled by our courage, by our behavior in the military theater, that we are never going to surrender to this terror, and we are not frightened of them, and whatever it takes, we will fight them. And I really hope the West takes something from this, to understand that sometimes it's not easy to deal with enemies, and sometimes you have to do unpleasant things. I promise you, nobody enjoys the cataclysm that is, the catastrophe that is Gaza right now. But I cannot see another way of doing this. And frankly, we could have had no casualties there. 170 of our boys have died there, and men and women have died there since the fighting, since the invasion of Gaza began. We needn't have lost a single person. We could have done everything from the air. The reason we didn't, and I'm proud of that, and of course it'll have to be reviewed to make sure we did our best. We have tried to spare innocent people as far as possible, but I also accept that this is a war we absolutely cannot lose, and it's a message to Hezbollah, to Syria, to Iran, to Iraq, to all the Arab countries that still harbor these secret desires to destroy us. It ain't gonna happen.
Absolutely. So let's have one of the latest news updates from our friends at CBN, looking how this war against Hamas could go on for months.
Hamas marked the start of the new year with a heavy rocket barrage directed at Tel Aviv and other parts of central and southern Israel. The rockets were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome or fell in open areas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier addressed the nation and said Israel is fighting on all fronts and that to win the war will take more time, many more months.
We are continuing to fight until the goals of the war have been achieved, especially the elimination of Hamas and the release of all our hostages. We are not relenting even for a moment in our efforts to bring our hostages back home, even at this very moment. We will ensure that Gaza no longer constitutes a threat to Israel, that there will be no element in it that finances terrorism, educates its children for terrorism, and pays the families of terrorists.
Netanyahu says all the soldiers and citizens he speaks to say the same thing: continue the battle.
They are fighting with force and new methods above and below ground. This is very complex fighting, but we have the upper hand.
The IDF said its troops were engaging in fierce battles against the terrorists. In one case, the terrorists were hiding among civilians and firing at Israel. In another, the IDF said it found a kindergarten where terrorists had set up explosive devices in anticipation of the Israeli troops. On Monday, Israel said it eliminated a Hamas commander who had led terrorists in the October 7th attack and afterwards against troops. Hezbollah kept up its attacks against northern Israel over the weekend, and Israel hit back hard, including in villages in southern Lebanon, from where Hezbollah was launching its attacks.
Hezbollah has turned the southern villages in southern Lebanon into a combat zone. To Hezbollah, just like Hamas, the residents of southern Lebanon do not matter. They are a human shield for them. We will continue to strike in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon. Wherever Hezbollah activates terror against us, they will encounter significant and powerful strikes.
U.S. Navy helicopters fired at Houthi rebels who were attacking a ship and then shot at the helicopters in the Red Sea. The U.S. battle is the latest attack by the Houthis on a major shipping route, and it's linked to the war in Gaza, as the Houthis, like Hezbollah, are backed by Iran.
Regarding Iran, Iran is leading the axis of evil and the aggression against us on the various fronts. This aggression is aimed not only at Israel, but at the entire free world.
Meanwhile, Israeli buildings lit up a message to call for the release of hostages, and Israeli President Herzog issued a New Year's call to world leaders in multiple languages on X, formerly Twitter, on behalf of the hostages held by Hamas. As we enter 2024, I call on the entire family of nations, on all world leaders, to demand and work for the immediate, unconditional release of our 133 hostages. Babies, the elderly, women, men are being held in brutal captivity by Hamas without vital medication or visitation from the Red Cross. Their immediate release is at the core of our battle with Hamas terrorists in Gaza. May the light dispel the darkness, and may the new year bring peace, hope, and healing for all. Families of hostages also put out short video greetings asking to be remembered during the New Year's celebrations.
I want you to celebrate today and smile and hug your loved ones and remember the 133 people that are still hostages by Hamas.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And that was thanks to our friends at CBN. Tony, we know that the Jewish community have really never felt this much hatred being directed towards them since the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe in the 1930s. How important is it that Christians have a biblical understanding of God's plans and purposes for Israel, but also do what you're doing, and that's reaching out to the Jewish community and to the state of Israel in love and solidarity at this time?
Well, I think it's vital, and I think one of the problems which we have in the Christian church, to be honest, is the amount of ignorance and unbelief in the Bible, which is supposed to be our foundational document. I mean, if you take the Bible literally, then God chose Abraham, made a covenant with Abraham to give him title deeds of ownership of that land, and be passed on to Isaac, Jacob, children of Israel, for perpetuity. And that even if the Jews are dispersed from the land, they come back to the land in fulfillment of prophecy. So you have prophecies in Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Jeremiah, which says, "He who scattered Israel will gather him, keep him as a shepherd does his flock." And we see it happening before our eyes. So we've seen Israel reborn as a nation, which is basically a miracle when you think of what was happening in just a few years before, the Holocaust and attempt to exterminate the Jewish people, and then you have the dry bones coming to life and Israel becoming a nation. It has to be a sign, if you like, of the faithfulness of God and the truth of the Bible. Most of the church ignores it and just says, well, we're Israel, or that this has nothing to do with the Bible, and that even anti-Semitic ideas in Christianity, that the Jews killed Jesus, are under a curse, and therefore we don't have anything to do with them, which is totally wrong theology, because Jesus was Jewish and he came as the Jewish Messiah to bring life and truth to all people. But also I think because this is because of the Islamic dimension, we have to be involved, because Islam is not just against Israel and the Jews, it's also against Christianity and Christians. And you know, I think one thing people don't realize, from an Islamic theology point of view, the world is divided into what they call the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb. So the house of Islam and the house of the enemy. And the house of Islam is the place where Muslims rule. And if Muslims rule, then Muslims have to be in control, and Jews and Christians may have their communities, but they have to be under the Muslims, what they call dhimmi citizens. They have to pay a tax called jizya, which is a sign of submission and inferiority. And as far as the Muslims are concerned, the whole of the Middle East is the Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Islam. So if Jews go into what they consider their land and take it over and now start ruling over Muslims, that goes against their whole theological position. So you have then this movement which is theological, basically. So like, I've got a quote here from Hamas. It says, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. So it's not just a political idea, it's not just about refugees and about living conditions, it's about the roots of Islam. Now, when you look into Islamic program, the program is first to get rid of Israel and the Jews, then to get rid of the Christians, and then they hope that their Jesus is going to come back with the Mahdi and Islamize the world, which means, of course, the end of Christianity. And even now you're seeing what, wherever Islam is ruling in the Middle East, anywhere, Christians are going to be suppressed. In fact, the only country where Christianity in any form is growing in the Middle East is Israel. So you have, even in the Palestinian areas, you've got persecution and suppression of Christians, and Hamas was suppressing the small Christian community in Gaza. So it's important actually that Israel's there, even for the Christians, and that we have to stand for what the Bible says, and the Bible does say there's going to be this conflict at the end of days, and that the nation's going to come against Israel, including countries surrounding Israel, and the have situations like in Psalm 83, which speaks about the nations saying, let's see, what does it say here? Let us take for ourselves the pastures of God for a possession. In other words, let's take what God's given to one group of people, the Jews, and take it for ourselves, give it to the Muslims. Now, from a, most people say, well, that's ancient history, it's got nothing to do with what's happening now, but if you look into it, it is actually what's happening now. And it's not just Hamas, actually, it's Fatah and the PLO as well want to do it. I mean, the PLO want to do it slightly slower, in stages. I was reminded of the, in 1974, just after the Yom Kippur War, PLO had a conference called the conference which they put forward what they call the 10 points phase policy, in which they would not try to defeat Israel at one go. They said that the Arabs have failed to do that. They weren't going to do that. So what we'll do is have phases in which we take part of the land, then use whatever part we've been given as a base from which to attack and destroy the rest of Israel. And you can see that's the program which they're working on. That's why they want the Palestinian state. That's why Israel doesn't want to have a Palestinian state. They see what's happened already in Gaza, that they've used what territory they've given as a base from which to attack and destroy Israel.
And Michael, along those lines, I mean, I think it's only a question of time really before Israel destroys Hamas as a terrorist organisation with its ideology as well, and that the people of Gaza will actually be free from the tyranny of Hamas. We also see the prospect that Israel may have to engage in military conflict with Hezbollah that pose a greater threat to Israel than Hamas does. But at the same time, this really does demonstrate really that by defeating Hamas, this is actually then defeating essentially the Islamic extremists and the terrorists in the region, because they say that they can't go up or move the Jewish state, which is a miracle and imposes, as Tony was saying, a huge theological challenge to the supremacy of Islam in the Middle East.
It does indeed, and that's why I think the stakes are so high here. And because they've saddled everything to this horse, which is contradictory actually, because the Quran very explicitly says that at the end of the days, the children of Israel will get Israel. The Quran says that. It says that as definitively as the Torah says it. And there are sensible Muslim voices. I haven't entirely lost hope there. And I think the drive of history and the self-evident facts of what happened on the 7th of October, I'm hoping will encourage decent Muslims, who I think are the majority, to actually say something and try and wrest their religion back from the violent people who are running it. I must tell you, there's one positive thing that's come out of this. I've lived in this country for a long time, since 1976, and I've been through all the crises of Israel that have happened here, and I carefully monitor what ordinary people, what the British man and woman on the street is saying. And I've never encountered so much support. I don't know whether it's because of the newspapers I read, and I read the comments there, whether it's the forum or fora that I engage in, But I don't think there's ever been so much support for Israel from ordinary people, ordinary British people. And I think it's obvious why. I think Britain and Germany and France are in a far more dangerous position than Israel is. Israel is united. It knows what it's doing. It knows why it's doing it. But you, because you have been systematically deprived of your own cultural landmarks and intellectual landmarks, people don't know what to think. So you're being handed this Hezbollah, Hamas axis as something normal. And you saw exactly where this leads to when they attacked the cenotaph, attacked policemen, attacked poppy sellers. In other words, ridiculed everything that is valuable in this country. Everything that we should hold as sacrosanct in this country was attacked by these people. And I think people are starting to realize it now. Why it's taken so long, well, that is another subject.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tony, what are your thoughts about the prospect that Israel's military war with Hamas could last all of 2024?
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu said it could, so he knows more about it than I do. But I think that it would be very difficult for Israel if it does, because you already mentioned the fact that all the reservists are not able to go to work. And I just talked to somebody who's just been in Israel. They were doing some voluntary work on fields, helping the farmers to get some crops in. And just that it's even the basic things of life are finding difficult to keep them going. So it would be very bad for Israel if it has to go on for so long. But it could do. And obviously, if it does extend to Hezbollah, then you've got a whole new dimension, which would threaten really big destruction.
Michael, I just want to read out a quote here by Israel's Defense Force spokesman, Daniel Hagari. So in a statement, he said that the Israel-Hamas war could last all of 2024. He said that objectives of the war require prolonged fighting, adding that Israel is preparing accordingly. We adapt our way of warfare and the forces required for each area in the Gaza Strip to carry out our mission in the best way, as each area has different characteristics and different operational needs. He says these adaptations are designed to ensure planning and preparation for the continuation of 2024 as the IDF plan ahead, understanding that we will be required for additional tasks and warfare throughout this year. And clearly Israel means business. This policy of allowing Hamas to remain in power in Gaza is no longer feasible after October the 7th. And that Israel knows for her deterrent capabilities with the Iranian proxies in the north, such as Hezbollah, and also in Syria as well, plus the Iranians, that the Israelis need to send a strong message, don't they? And also, they don't want anything ever to happen on October the 7th again. And that's why Hamas has to be destroyed.
I mean, this has huge implications, and you're dead right. Now, I'm one person who always kind of believed in the two-state solution as an ethical settlement of this issue, not because I believe they deliver anything other than a failed anti-Semitic state, but because it seemed to me the only rational way of dealing with the situation ethically. Well, I honestly don't know if I believe in the two-state solution now. What would happen if the West Bank had been Gaza?
Exactly.
We left Gaza in 2004, and within a year they were fighting. They were waging war against us without any hope of a settlement. They say so. The entire objective of the war is to destroy us. And I don't think it's any different in the West Bank. So I don't know where we go from here. But at least in Israel, and I think in the West, in some Western capitals, if they allow themselves to, there's a much more realistic idea of what we're facing here. And I do hope that in the long run it will not only better the fortunes of the Israeli people, but the Palestinian people as well, with whom I have no desire to be at war. They've been hijacked by an Islamist ideology, which frankly is as threatening to Islam as it is to Judaism and Christianity. And they're going to have to make some sensible adult choices. Will they do it? Frankly, on previous behavior, I doubt it. But we are in a situation where there is some possibility of progress. It's really up to the Arab world, and it's up to the Western world. I hesitate to call it the Christian world, because sadly it's no longer that.
Yeah, yes.
But the Western world have got to take some responsibility now. It's their money, essentially, that's built those rockets, that's purchased those rockets, that's built those tunnels. There are no public protection bomb shelters in Gaza, only for Hamas. And the West has got to stand up now and say what it's doing there. And it can't play this double game where it secretly hopes for the destruction of Israel and it makes deals with Iran in order to sell contracts abroad. There has to be a greater ethical responsibility now.
Absolutely.
Do I expect it? No. Should it happen? Yes.
And Tony, I mean, we have to address the fact here that Hamas leaders are using this conflict in order to enrich themselves. I mean, the leaders of Hamas are living in Doha, in Qatar. They're worth anything between £3 and £4 billion each. They're living in complete luxury, whilst the residents of Gaza are living in poverty. They haven't got proper water sanitation because Hamas don't provide that. Instead, all the money and the international aid money comes in is built on these massive great terror tunnels and terrorist infrastructure. So surely the West has to also then think that the answer is not to plough more and more money into Gaza and enrich the pockets of the leaders of Hamas while their own people are living in absolute abject poverty, and they have brought this war upon the people of Gaza. It wasn't Israel did it, it was Hamas that did it.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, one hopes so. I mean, the problem is most of our media doesn't really draw attention to this, to put it mildly. And, I was watching a sort of Israeli satirical film about the guys in Doha, is it Doha?
Oh, yeah.
With their billions of dollars and sending out weeping propaganda to sort of get money coming in, and yet, the money's going to them rather than to the people who are suffering. But that's the whole story, isn't it? I mean, it's even how it works in Russia as well, that, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and they're supporting their system rather than helping the people. And I think when you look, I think right back at the beginning of the conflict, was it Faisal who met Weizmann and said we should bring the Jews into the Middle East to help build up the country to make it a better place? Whether they've done that. What they've done is they've made all of their countries pretty miserable places, and some of them pretty horrible places. And, I was looking at one of the points I made in one of my talks is you look at what Israel's done with that land in 75 years, what their accomplishments in medical, agriculture, technological, all kinds of things, what they've achieved and what they've achieved for the benefit of all people. You ask yourself, what have the Muslim fundamentalists achieved? What has Iran achieved since its Islamic revolution? Nothing but terror, weapons, missiles, destruction.
Bloodshed.
And they brought it upon their own people, and the first people who suffer are the people themselves. And we got a lot of Iranians come to our fellowship, and we had a lot to do with Iranians, and the feelings they have towards their government is unmentionable. It's pretty much worse than what we think about it. And probably I don't know if this is true or not, but somebody told me that half the mosques in Iran are empty now because people have turned off from...
I think they've closed 50,000 out of 75,000.
Or even more than half, yeah.
Because people are not, they're so disillusioned.
Their main achievement has been to turn people off Islam. And quite a lot becoming Christians as well.
One aspect of this war I really want to talk about is the propaganda war, which is effectively the mainstream media's reporting of this, how this is reported on social media. Not only is it inflaming hatred against Israel, but we're also seeing that this is the main driving force for this rise of Jew hatred that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I think this has been fundamentally disruptive to our culture in the West. If you look at the performance of the BBC, it's been absolutely shameful. Yeah. From a Jewish point of view, it's barely believable. I worked there for about 8 years. And their insistence on defending this prejudice is frankly perverted. And they do lead the pack, so people follow them. But what is encouraging also is that many people do not subscribe. You no longer have this unitary power of the BBC. There are other ways to get your information now. Now, a lot of that information, of course, will be perverted in its own way, because it's going to come from the the Islamist and the leftist quarters. But there are a lot of creditable journalists now who are exploding the myths created by the BBC and the other broadcasters. And I actually think that's been one of the most positive things of all, how it's denuded the power of the BBC, which no longer has this hegemonic intellectual power. Good, it doesn't deserve it. It's abused it for years, and it's time for it to go.
Absolutely. So let's have a look and see how Hamas is using propaganda to influence our media and social media. And this is thanks to our friends at the Israeli Foreign Ministry.
Someone is manipulating you, and it's working. Modern-day war doesn't only occur on the battlefield. Algorithms are being tampered with to gain your sympathy, all because of different actors with malignant intentions. When it comes to information war, it's easy to forget that the opinions circulating publicly can genuinely affect people's lives. Since October 7th, cybersecurity experts have identified several coordinated campaigns with tens of thousands of bots or fake accounts linked to the Hamas terrorist organization. Terrorists filmed the massacre of Israeli communities and broadcast the graphic images on platforms through sock puppet accounts to amplify exposure. Hamas then began to delegitimize Israel and convince the world that all the incriminating evidence is false. Experts were surprised at how fast and far wide Hamas's messages spread online. The disinformation spread like wildfire. For example, within 24 hours of the explosion at the Al Ali hospital, research found that a third of the accounts discussing the hospital on X, formerly Twitter, were fake. These accounts spread Hamas's false narrative, claiming Israel had struck the hospital and killed hundreds, when in reality, the Islamic Jihad launched the misfired rocket. Once Israel had completed a thorough investigation into the incident, the headlines had already solidified. Unfortunately, Hamas succeeded in manipulating the public. Disinformation has brought even verified facts into question. Be aware of this when you read the news. Always remember to check your sources and make sure they aren't influenced by terrorist organizations.
And so it's imperative that we all check our facts, that you can check the programme, check the facts that we're mentioning on this programme with the evidence that we present on what's happening with Israel's war against Hamas, because there is so much deception out there, there is so much lies out there. One of the biggest lies that I'm hearing, Tony, I've had someone confront me on this, I've had someone send me an email on this, saying that Hamas carried out a small terrorist attack on October the 7th. But they did not carry out the horrific murders against those young Israelis who attended the Nova Music Festival, and the attack on those beautiful kibbutzes in the south of Israel next to the Gaza Strip, that this was done by the IDF as a pretext, the invasion, to invade Gaza. I mean, these are the horrific conspiracy theories that are coming out, that even so many Christians now are getting caught up and believing this is the case.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah, and there's a program which I commented on. I can't remember who made it now, but he's one of the sort of right-wing, anti-New World Order kind of people, which was really saying just what you said, that it was the Israelis had manipulated the whole thing, the Rothschilds were behind it, it was all part of the globalist conspiracy, and the aim was to have the war and then to sort of make a world government from Jerusalem, which I thought was... I wrote to him and said, this is ridiculous, and fans, you know, how can you justify any of this? And he refused to enter into any argument with me about it. But it's, I mean, I suppose, you know, people, when they stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And you've got people believing in all kinds of things which are totally unbelievable. I mean, obviously, you know, people knew the children, the young people who were killed, people saw it was photographed, even Hamas photographed it so they could send it back to say how proud they were of what they'd done. So it's unquestionable to question what really happened.
And this is the fight of our generation, is it, at this time, to actually fight for truth?
Holocaust denial as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah. But linked to Holocaust denial, linked to did Israel carry out these attacks? We know that all the evidence, even if you planted these people in the same room, would meet the victims of the Hamas terrorist attacks, seen the evidence for the destruction of these kibbutzes, seen these dead, burnt babies, and all the forensic evidence, and even the images on the webcam, they still won't believe the truth.
No, indeed. I mean, the idea is so ridiculous. If you know anything about Israel, you'll know the intimacy of relations within that country, that nobody is ever something beyond 2 degrees of separation from anybody. You meet in the army, you meet everywhere. It's an extremely social country. And the idea that the Israeli army would carry out these atrocities as a way is so ridiculous. And frankly, I take some solace from that, because it shows how pathetic the intellectual arguments of our enemies are. They're actually ridiculous. And ultimately, anyway, one must... the truth is what matters. not what's fashionable on social medias, and it doesn't matter how many likes and loves something gets. If it's a lie, it's still a lie. And we on our side know what lies are, and we know what the truth is, and thank God the war is going pretty well at the moment.
Absolutely. And one of the major issues you have to really discuss is how much money Hamas has invested, millions and millions of international aid money in their terror tunnels. And one of the latest discoveries just before Christmas was this huge terror tunnel that went up to the Eretz crossing. I mean, we're talking here in the region of 310 miles of tunnels. Why do you think Hamas needed all these tunnels?
Well, I guess they got something to hide. And, you know, they want to keep themselves underground. And this is, I mean, I guess, I mean, if you want to think in spiritual terms, I mean, what works in the darkness, underground, deceit, hatred, destruction, that's what's behind the whole movement. And Hamas, actually, what does it mean? Destruction in Hebrew, I think it is. But you've got this movement which is based upon terror and lies, and it has to function in the darkness because its ultimate aim is to destroy Israel. And, you know, they've got to hide their weapons. So why do they need all these missiles? Why does Iran invest so much money in producing missiles to give to Hezbollah, to Iran, to the Houthis, to everybody else? Only for destruction. So you've got a whole network of a whole infrastructure which is based on destruction, which you've got, I mean, with Russia as well. What's Russia doing in Ukraine? What's the basis of the Russian economy now? You've got this coming together of tyrannical forces which can only produce things which are destructive and harmful. And we've got to defend ourselves against them, whether we're Israelis or British or Ukrainians or whatever. We've got to stand against it and stand for freedom and democracy.
I mean, your thoughts as well. I mean, maybe it's taken the Israelis by surprise, the extent of 310 miles of tunnels. But Israel had a warning about this, didn't they, in 2014, when Israel last went in with a major ground offensive into Gaza after they fired their rockets and missiles that paralyzed 2/3 of the country. And Israel had no other choice but to send in ground troops. That's when they discovered the plan for Rosh Hashanah in 2014 to attack the neighboring kibbutzes, to take as hostages and take them back to Gaza using these terror tunnels.
Absolutely right. We've known about the tunnels for a very long time. We've seen their murderous consequences. But every time we go in there, we're told by the world that we must be restrained, we must be proportionate, whatever that means. And we mustn't attack the tunnels. The tunnels are there purely as an expression of terrorist intent. That's the only reason they're there. And what's interesting is the way this has turned out, because the tunnels have proven to be their biggest weakness, actually. Because of Israeli resolve and intelligence, and I have to say, after the spectacular intelligence failure of October the 7th, I'm hugely relieved that our intelligence since then has been improved. And this has turned out to be their Achilles heel, really. The tunnels, once we get into them, are not that safe a place for Hamas or Hezbollah. That's one of the reasons the war is actually going in our favor, is because we do understand the limitations of tunnel warfare, and now so do they.
No, absolutely, and we just saw on screen there the extent of some of these terror tunnels that have been discovered by Israel, by Israeli forces in Gaza. So let's have a look at this latest CBN News report looking in the discovery of these huge terror tunnels found in Gaza.
The tunnel runs under what's called the elite quarter of Gaza City, including Palestine Square.
You can see behind me the community college. You can see there the Alpha Luna Society for Deaf Children. You can see government buildings. You can see civilian buildings. From outside, everything looks normal. Everything looks like a regular city.
The square is the center of the strategic tunnel network, housing Hamas leadership's strongholds. It connects to the underground infrastructure near the Rantisi Hospital and the Shifa Hospital uncovered earlier. The tunnel shafts are located in residences and offices of senior officials, allowing for covert descent, enabling Hamas operatives to escape and remain in hideouts for a long time.
There's an electricity box here. This opens. This was closed. This is actually a door, not the back of a box, which reaches a space that leads to the tunnel shaft below.
President Biden says the U.S. is still trying to restart negotiations for a ceasefire that includes a hostage release and humanitarian aid to Gaza.
We're pushing it. There's no expectation at this point, but we are pushing.
A top Hamas leader arrived in Egypt for talks, but the terror group says there will be no hostage negotiations without a ceasefire. Meanwhile, in the north, Israel struck Hezbollah infrastructure after the Iranian-backed group fired a rocket barrage that hit the city of Kiryat Shmona overnight, causing damage but no injuries. IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi told reservists that Israel will not return to the previous situation along the northern border.
This means to push further, to reinforce this, and to bring the residents back here, to Netua, and along the entire border line, to a different situation that is much more secure.
While another Iranian proxy, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, are threatening to target American warships after the U.S. announced an international force in the region to protect global shipping from Houthi attacks. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
So now we're seeing the evidence emerging of how Hamas was able to carry out the worst mass terrorist attack in Israel's history on the 7th of October using that huge terror tunnel, which is only 400 meters from the Eretz crossing, and how they then use these tunnels to actually to protect themselves from any Israeli surveillance. Michael, I have to ask you on one of the latest developments to take place this week, and that is with the assassination of the deputy leader of Hamas, Salman al-Azuri, in Beirut, and he was being protected by Hezbollah. Now they're talking about this could have huge strategic ramifications.
In a way, I hope it does have huge strategic ramifications. I hope it sends the message to all the Hamasniks and all the other people who support him that they won't be safe anywhere in the world. Because when we say never again after the Holocaust, you know, there were shades of the Holocaust in what happened on October the 7th. The methodologies were the same, the hatred, the barbarism was the same. We want them to know that it's not going to happen again. And I'm glad it was a successful operation, and I hope they can expect many more of these, not least in Doha.
No, absolutely. And Tony, I mean, there is a prospect now that we could see an escalation in the north because Hezbollah pose a bigger threat than Hamas with anything between 160 and 200,000 rockets and missiles, many of them with laser-guided missiles, and backed up also by Iranian forces in Syria, so like 80,000 together with their proxies as well in Syria. So for Israel to secure her northern border, a war with Hezbollah is inevitable, isn't it?
It looks likely, yes. I mean, one has to use the word inevitable, but obviously from a biblical point of view, there is a passage in the Bible in Ezekiel 38 about a war coming down from the north, which involves alliance of countries, including Persia and Togarmah, which is probably Turkey. And most people say Russia, but Russia's a bit involved in Ukraine at the moment to get involved in a war over Israel. But you have all these forces coming together, and the Bible does say that there's going to be this time of trouble in the end of days. We wish it didn't say that, but it does. There'll be the time of Jacob's trouble, the time of the last days conflict, which will lead up, from our point of view, to the second coming of Jesus. And you know, one thing which I mentioned in my talk yesterday or on Sunday was that there were a group of soldiers going into Gaza, and they got together and they were singing the Ani Ma'amim, I believe, with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. And it just reminded me that there is this messianic dimension behind it. And you know, from the Jewish point of view, is this the sign of the coming of the Messiah? And from the Christian point of view, of the coming again of the Messiah. And it speaks about Jerusalem being the burdensome stone, burdening all nations. It speaks about the nations in Joel dividing up the land. And God has an controversy with them. And that's, you know, one of the things I said actually was that if you take God and the Messiah out of it, then the situation is pretty awful and hopeless. But if you bring God and the Messiah into it, then you have a hope. And ultimately, I do believe this is leading for the second coming of Jesus, who will be revealed as Yeshua HaMashiach, not the God of the Gentiles, but the Messiah of Israel and the Saviour of the world, and that he loves Jews and Gentiles and wants them to come to faith in Yeshua and deliver us from this horrible Islamic and secular violent thing which is coming upon the world, and help us to find some way to love God and to love one another, which is what is sadly missing in the world today.
It's got 3 minutes left of the programme. Michael, what are your thoughts on this one? Because clearly one of the byproducts of the horrific Hamas attack on the 7th of October not only will be to unify Israel and to unify the Jewish people, but with this rising Jew hatred around the world, won't more people make Aliyah in fulfilment of biblical prophecy in 2024? Because they realise that there is only one Jewish state and there's only one government that will look after us, and that's the nation of Israel.
There is certainly a lot of discussion of Mashiach in Jewish circles now. But we have a tendency not to talk too loudly about that, because let's face it, we've made a few mistakes in the past. I'm thinking of Shabbatai Tzvi and Jacob Frank and various other people. And generally we don't talk about the Messiah much, but definitely it's present in all our thoughts with this. And I heard something quite interesting the other day. Somebody was talking about the position of the Jews in 1946. If you looked out on the Jewish world in 1946, European Judaism had been destroyed. The yeshivot, the great rabbinical schools, had gone. American Jews were all changing their noses and joining country clubs and changing their surnames so as not to be Jewish. European Judaism was finished. Israel was about to be destroyed because there was no way 600,000 or so defenseless Jews could possibly defend themselves against the Arab world, especially given the support the Arab world was being given by the Allied countries. And look where we are today. We've built up this most astonishing country, which is not only powerful, but ethically powerful, that is united, that in brotherhood and love. And who knows, I would never say I think the Messiah is going to come, but it's one of Maimonides' principle that we should believe it, and increasingly I do.
So Michael and Tony, thank you so much for being my guests on the first Middle East Report 2024. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. We need to continue to step up our prayers for Israel, particularly those brave and courageous soldiers who are serving with the Israeli Defence Force, who are not only defending Israel, but they are defending the West and us against this evil ideology known as Hamas and Islamic extremism. And it's imperative that we also stand with our Jewish friends and the nation of Israel during this time. We only have to open our Bible to realise how much God loves his people and his land. So I want to thank you for watching the first episode of the Middle East Report for 2024.